Delighted to welcome you all to this little session on fire doors and in particular what we now have to do as a result of the Fire Safety England regulations that came into force a couple of days ago. As some of you will know, I head up the construction department here at Devonshires and I, for once, am not going to be doing most of the talking today. I'm delighted to welcome Ali Fletcher, who is one of my senior assistants, who's going to tell you a little bit about the regulations and what it is we have to do. I'm also joined by Lee Russell, a partner of Devonshires, who's going to talk about some of the leasehold issues and some of the more practical concerns and considerations that we're going to have to apply when looking at fire doors. But I really am delighted to welcome two gentlemen who are going to talk really about the practical implications of this and how we actually go about doing the risk assessments and what we have to look for. And I'm joined by Steve Cooper, who's a fire engineer from Hollis International. And Steve's slides are rather wonderfully called "When is a fire door not a fire door?" He's going to explore that issue and he's going to cover a lot more besides. And I'm also delighted to welcome Andrew Mellor, who most of you, I'm sure, will know. Andrew is a partner at PRP and an architect. And an expert on all manner of things, including fire doors. So Andrew's going to look at some of the things that we have to start considering and some of the things that we're going to have to explore in detail when we start carrying out our risk assessments on fire doors to the front entrance door of properties, as well as communal fire doors. And if I can just say, we will take questions and answers at the end of the session. Those questions that we don't get to, we will address in writing and circulate that to all participants today. So without further ado, I'm going to let Ali start and give us a whistle-stop tour of what these regulations actually require us to do in relation to fire doors. Just to note, we're not going to talk about the information requirements for buildings over 18 metres. That's all very clearly set out in the regulations. Today is all about fire doors. Ali.
Thanks, Mark. So as Mark indicated, the regulations place a number of obligations on the responsible person, but we're just going to be focusing on Article 10 today, which relates specifically to fire doors. And the obligations apply to buildings depending on their building height. So firstly, we're going to look at Article 10.2, which deals with the provision of information to residents. And various of the other speakers will talk about that in further detail today, but we're just going to go through the actual obligations. So this obligation applies to pretty much all buildings, and that's where buildings which contain two or more sets of domestic premises and which contain common parts through which residents would need to evacuate in the case of an emergency. And the regulation specifically states that a responsible person must provide required information about fire doors to residents. So in terms of what information is required, things such as fire doors should be kept shut when not in use, residents or their guests should not tamper with self-closing devices, and residents should report any faults or damages with doors immediately to the responsible person. So in practical terms, a responsible person will need to make clear to residents how they communicate any faults and have a clear channel of communication open to all residents. So in terms of when that information should be provided, a responsible person has 12 months to provide this information to residents, which are currently in situ, up from the date which the regulations came into place, which was the 23rd of January 2023. So you have until the 23rd of January 2024 to provide this information in relation to fire doors to residents. And with regards to new residents, you need to provide that information as soon as reasonably practicable. So the next requirement applies to buildings which contains two or more sets of domestic premises and measures above 11 metres in height. And that requires a responsible person to use their best endeavours to undertake annual checks of fire doors at the entrances of individual domestic premises in buildings. And Lee Russell, a partner in our housing management and property litigation team, will come on to what best endeavours means, and we'll take you through some practical steps of what a responsible person can do in order to ensure that obligation is met. The regulation specifically states that a responsible person must document what steps have been taken in order to gain access, including, and this is very important, cases where access has been denied. Again, this is something which Lee Russell will cover later on in the seminar. Regulations also specifically states that these checks on the front entrance doors must include ensuring that the self-closing devices for the doors are working properly. So the last regulation which we're going to speak about today is, again, only applicable to buildings which measure above 11 metres in height and contain 2 or more sets of domestic premises. And that is the requirement for the responsible person to undertake checks on any fire doors in communal areas at least every 3 months. Again, it specifically states, like the requirement to check the front entrance doors, the checks must include things such as ensuring the self-closing devices for the doors are working properly. In terms of what fire doors in communal areas actually means, that means communal doors, which typically include doors to stairways and stairway lobbies, cross-corridor doors, doors to storage and electrical equipment cupboards, and doors to riser shafts within which various services run. So I'm now going to pass over to Lee Russell, who's going to talk about best endeavours and information recording.
Thanks very much.
Sorry, Lee, before you jump in, let me just stress one thing to all of our attendees today. As a result of these regulations, you've got until the end of January 2024 to carry out your risk assessment of all front entrance doors, and you're going to have to start thinking about doing it now in relation to the first quarterly check for communal fire doors within buildings. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be thought about immediately, and steps have to start being taken now. So I just wanted to emphasise that before Lee comes on to his section. So sorry, my apologies for interrupting you, Lee.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, so as Ellie mentioned, I'm just going to talk over these next couple of slides in terms of the legal arrangements about how we ultimately get access to carry out these checks, and also particularly how we ensure that we record, keep and also log those checks being undertaken. One, to actually ensure that we put in practice the actual regulatory requirements to carry out the checks in a meaningful way, but also just as important to try and ensure that we are able to evidence those checks being undertaken should we be asked to evidence it at any point in the future. And as Ellie mentioned, we're talking really about 2 elements of checks. One is the communal doors. The likelihood is that you're not going to have any issues with access and carrying those out. Those are within the communal parts of the building, and you'll have control and easy access to carry those out in a relatively easy and straightforward manner. Where there might be difficulties with access, or where we need to think slightly more carefully about the legal framework that underpins actually carrying the checks out, is particularly in relation to the flat front entrance doors. And it's very clear, in order to carry out a successful check of that door, you will need access to be able to actually open the door and look at both sides of it to ensure that the check is undertaken in compliance with the regs. And what the regulations require is the use of best endeavours to ensure that access is obtained to carry out that check. And those are not familiar with legal terms, you'll often see differences between reasonable endeavours or best endeavours. And from a legal perspective, there is a distinction and a difference between the two. And our view is likely to be that best endeavours requires a much higher requirement, a much more onerous obligation to ensure that those checks are undertaken. And now that we have the relevant guidance documents from the government, it's very clear, in our view anyway, that that expectation is likely to mean the use of a legal injunction order to compel access where it previously has not been successfully obtained by voluntary or by written agreement or otherwise between you as the responsible person and whoever the ultimate occupier is. And it's important to bear in mind that these are ultimately likely to be tenants and or leaseholders, And it doesn't really matter what the occupier arrangements are, ensuring that you use your best endeavours to get access is likely to require some sort of legal action where that cannot be obtained easily. It's also worth just pausing there to have a look at what documents we have in order to try and understand what the regulations require, what access arrangements there are. There are obviously the regulations themselves, but the government have over the last couple of months produced a number of sets of guidance documents, particularly 2 guidance documents. One is called Check Your Fire Safety Responsibilities Under the Regs. One is called Fire Safety Regulations Fire Door Guidance, the latter of which was issued just a couple of weeks ago. And then we also have a fact sheet. And really, it's looking at all of those documents together that builds that picture of ultimately how those checks will need to be undertaken and how access might need to be obtained. And we've put a few quotes from the guidance documents that's lifted from across those documents there. And you can see particularly the last one where the government suggests that in the event of an impasse where access can't be obtained, then a court order can be obtained for this purpose. Now, in relation to tenancy agreements, those are often reviewed on a frequent basis, and the hope and likelihood is that most of your tenancy agreements will actually have very wide clauses allowing access to be able to be obtained, and that if that's not given, you'll be quite easily be able to go off to the county court and get an injunction to ensure that access can be compelled. In relation to a lease, that's slightly more difficult because often leases may well be very old indeed, or they may well be drafted, certainly without these statutory provisions in mind. That said, most leases, modern or indeed very old leases, will normally have wide access clauses that can be relied upon to ensure that you as a landlord responsible person will be able to carry out the checks. Even if they don't, in light of this new statutory obligation, our view again is that it's very easy to argue that there will be implied terms into either your tenancy agreements or your lease agreements that will require the occupier to ensure that access is given for you to comply with these new statutory obligations. That said, if you are carrying out a tenancy review in the short term, or you are looking at new leases being granted, it's important that perhaps there is express provision in relation to access that will include these types of access requirements to ensure compliance with the regulations moving forwards. In terms of practical steps that need to be taken, well, ultimately that will be set out hopefully within a policy and procedure, and we'll talk about that in a few moments' time. But that will really require a number of appointment letters to be sent, setting out a specific date and time that the check will be carried out, or perhaps inviting the occupier to get in touch to provide alternatives. And then it's really important that we actually ensure that we go to carry out the check. So what sometimes happens is that a landlord or responsible person will write to the occupier and say, look, we want to come on this date and time. Can you get in touch to confirm that that's okay? And then if nobody gets in touch, nobody is then sent for access to be carried out. Now, technically speaking, under the relevant tenancy or lease, there's no breach there. There's no requirement under a lease or a tenancy to communicate or get in touch with your ultimate landlord. It's the act of actually not allowing access that allows a breach that can be enforced later down the line. So ensuring that somebody actually goes at that specific date and time in order to try and at least attempt to carry out the check in order to get access is going to be really important should there be issues with that later down the line. In the event that you do have to take legal action, courts generally will expect at least a few occasions or a few attempts made as to access. We probably recommend at least 2, if not 3. And also ensuring that we keep a good log and written record of all of those letters and records if we need to go off and seek an injunction order. If access is still not obtained at that point, then again, trying some alternative means by perhaps actually going to the property, door knocking, perhaps involving your relevant fire and rescue service in order to try and stress the importance are all things that we probably recommend. And then ultimately, as a last resort, you might consider instructing solicitors. And that probably will be a case of having a let-for action on solicitors' letterhead, very similar to the way that you might undertake your gas safety checks at the moment, and to ask effectively a last-ditch attempt for access to be given. And if that's still not given on that occasion, then ultimately you may well have to go off and seek an injunction. With that access are the requirements to ensure not just that the checks are actually carried out, but within the regs themselves, it requires you to ensure that a record is kept of that. Obviously, we're going to talk later, and when I pass over to Steve and Andrew about what those checks will actually require. But it's really important that what they do require is that a record is kept of everything that's done with that. The suggestion within the guidance and fact sheets is that the checks will be relatively straightforward and easy to be carried out. But if there are more detailed checks required, then again, making sure that there's a proper record of those being undertaken or those being instructed by way of external contractors or otherwise. And it's perhaps important to mention within the documents that I mentioned earlier that the government have issued a draft checklist, which again, I think is probably a very handy document, which you'll be able to use to actually record all of the things that the regulations require the check to actually look at. And again, those are set out in more detail within the guidance documents that I mentioned. If you do want a handy area where you can find all of these documents and also the draft checklist link, if you go to our website for our recent article on these doors, you'll see it all set out within that, and we can get that circulated within the packs that you'll get from our business development team after today's session. So as always, it's really important that not just compliance with the regulations, but also that we're able to evidence that. So ensuring that those logs and those records are kept are going to be very key, and particularly if access does need to be enforced by way of a legal injunction order or otherwise, then you're going to need to obtain those and keep those to ensure that you're actually able to successfully obtain an injunction order if legal action is required. And what ultimately underpins all of that is ensuring that you have proper policy and procedures in place, certainly from a regulatory requirement, ensuring that there's a standardised process, one, arranging access, carrying out the checks, what those checks should include, and ultimately how that's recorded and records are kept to evidence those. You need that standardised across your businesses. And again, that's going to look and feel very similar to the gas safety checks that we undertake at the moment. So if you haven't already started looking at your policy and procedures, we'd certainly recommend that you do so now. As Mark mentioned, we've got a year for the first compliance for the front door checks, but the communal checks, for example, will need to be carried out quarterly, and we quickly run out of time very easily and very quickly. So getting those policies and procedures in place as soon as possible, and again, we can support you with those if needs be. But hopefully that's helpful, and I'll hand over to Steve, if that's okay.
Yes, but before we do that, I'm going to somewhat transgress on what I said earlier, which is that we'll deal with questions afterwards, because we've had a number of questions that relate pretty much to what Lee has been saying. So I'll read through those questions so we can deal with it all in this section of the seminar. And I think the first question is a very astute one, and it's an issue that we've had to advise on previously, which is this: if a flat entrance door needs replacing and it is down to the owner to replace, but they refuse to do this, what measures can the RMC or managing agent or responsible person indeed, for example, take to ensure the flat owner complies and replaces the door? So in other words, this is a situation where we've risk assessed the door, as we're required to do, because that obligation has no relevance to who owns the door or who's responsible for it. But if, in fact, it's the resident who owns the door and is responsible for it, if we decide that that door needs to be remediated or replaced, how do we go about doing that in a practical sense? So, Lee, what would you advise in those circumstances?
Certainly. So, as we all know, with leases, you'll often see various different variations of one where the front entrance door might belong to us as landlords. In those circumstances, that should be relatively straightforward. Generally speaking, we can do what we so wish, and hopefully there will be relevant service charge provisions that will allow recovery. That said, these leases do always need to be reviewed in the round, and you'll need to take a case-by-case legal advice on the actual lease, and also why you ultimately want them to either replace or repair or otherwise put in place a new door. Where things get more difficult are the circumstances that I mentioned in this question, where the leaseholder themselves are demised the front entrance door. We still have to ensure that we carry out the check, and if as a result of that check it looks like actually there is some damage to it, there's some issues with the seals or otherwise, then we're ultimately going to need to use the lease as the vehicle to try and enforce whatever we want to be done with that door. And now we'll keep, for the purposes of today, a very simple example that if you check it and let's say the self-closing device, which again is part of the actual specific check, is broken, it's sort of off its hinges or is no longer there, then that very clearly, in my view, is likely to require the leaseholder to comply with their obligations to repair and maintain. Most leases, modern or otherwise, will very clearly have a requirement for the leaseholder to ensure that repair and maintenance is adhered to in terms of all of their aspects of their demise, and you'll be able to enforce that lease as you ordinarily would in any other lease enforcement case. Where there might be underlying inherent defect issues with the door, that's when we get slightly more complex area, which is probably beyond scope of today, but I'd always recommend getting specific legal advice in those circumstances. But I think the short answer is if those checks show that there's some sort of damage or issue, which is what the checks are really trying to look at, then the hope is that if that lease front entrance door is demised to the leaseholder, then there will be enforcement provisions within that lease that require them to undertake the works that are required. And following that normal enforcement process is what I'd probably recommend in those circumstances.
Okay, thank you, Lee. A couple of questions from Ian Reid. I think, Ian, we've answered your first one, which is in relation to best endeavours, where you say that RPs will need to adopt a similar process to the current system adopted for gas safety inspections. Well, we absolutely agree with that. That is correct. Your second question is an interesting one, which is this: as well as arranging access for the initial check, there is likely to be access issues to return and to carry out identified remedial works that cannot be completed during the initial inspection. Well, I think that's absolutely right. There is obviously the requirement to gain access for the initial inspection, but the inspector is not going to be carrying out remedial work. So if remedial works or indeed a door replacement is required, that's going to require a secondary or possibly even a tertiary series of access arrangements. And Lee, I imagine in relation to each of these, the same principles apply.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you identify that works are required, that's really the same as works, in any other case. There's nothing sort of special about particularly the fire front entrance doors. If you're required to get access to carry out works, then you should follow that same process. Obviously, with tenants, it's much more straightforward in those cases. With leases, then we need to go through what I've just talked through and actually work out whose responsibility does that fall in. Is it us to do that, in which case we carry out the check and we require access in the usual way. If it's the leaseholder, then we might need to look to the lease to enforce them to actually carry it out as part of their obligations under the lease.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We've had a couple of other questions as well, but I think they have Steve Cooper and Andrew Mellor's name written all over them. So just one very quick one. In relation to the link to the 3 government publications, we will circulate a link in the pack of information that all attendees get after the seminar, which will contain a link to those documents. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Steve Cooper.
Thanks, Mark. Morning, everyone. So when is a fire? Oh, Ellie. Thanks. That was a joke, not a very good one, obviously. When is a fire door not a fire door? Okay, please. When it's ajar. I think it's the first joke I heard when I was about 6. It's in Beano or something, and it tickled me, and I've been trying to use it ever since. This is the first time. But obviously, fire doors play a massive role in the fire compartmentation in the building, and that affects means of escape, fire get access, fire spread, smoke spread, etc., etc. So a fire door that's not shut is just a hole in a wall, and that wall will have a fire resisting purpose. So a hole in it isn't great. So a fire door that doesn't shut because of a defective self-closer or no self-closer is obviously not going to work as a fire door. When it's not a fire door, it's a complex system of individual components. I think we do talk about fire doors. We should be talking about fire door sets, because a fire door is not just the wooden leaf that fills the hole. It's the frame. It's the way the frame's fitted to the reveal. It's the door furniture, the overhead closer, the hinges and everything else that goes with it. So a fire door is tested and developed with a certain set of fire components, set of door furniture. If you start changing the door furniture away from what was installed or what was tested with it, then it ceases to be a fully functional fire door. Changing the door furniture, for example, can mean that it would fail in a fire test were it to be tested again. So it is a kit of parts. Those parts are inextricably linked, and you can't really mess about with them too much without going back to the manufacturer. Obviously, when a door is damaged or it's not maintained adequately, it's going to probably affect its fire resisting abilities. Certainly if it's not closing, if the smoke seals are damaged, if the self-closer is damaged or unscrewed, obviously that's going to affect its ability to do its job. When it's a nominal or notional fire door, these are two new additions to the lexicon, which I'll come on to a little bit later after this one. So what is a fire door? What does it look like? Well, obviously it's a solid wooden core, except you can get glass or steel or composite. It's probably 45 mil thick minimum, but it could be 54 mil thick, and sort of a rule of thumb, although I'm not sure how accurate this is, 44 mil is generally probably going to be a 30-minute fire door, and a 54 mil thick door is possibly going to give you 60 minutes, subject to the door furniture and everything else and the way it's fitted. We'll have 3 hinges, steel, maybe brass, but typically steel. The British standard quaintly refers to 1.5 pairs of hinges. It's actually 3, yeah, say 3 hinges, is what I mean. But you do get fire doors that have been tested successfully with 2 hinges or with floor hinges. Self-closing device, yeah, obviously we all know that, although not all fire doors have self-closing devices. If it's a door that can be normally kept shut, such as a cupboard door, riser door, it doesn't need self-closers. When we're talking about self-closing devices, we generally think about these overhead self-closers, which are, in my view, more effective, more robust, but you can get the chains that fit into the door jamb. They are acceptable if the door's been tested with them. In my experience, they're less resilient to wearing, and they do tend to stretch a little bit, and then the door doesn't close against the latch. Self-closing device must make sure the door fully closes against any locking device or latch that's fitted to the door. And there'll be cold smoke seals, which are like the draft excluders, brush or reflex type. So there might be a thin black rubber seal or blade, or they might have a brush like a draft excluder type thing. You need to make sure it's not just a draft excluder, and it is actually a cold smoke seal. The same cold smoke seal that the door was tested with and came with. And if it gets damaged, you can't just change it. If it's painted over, you can't just swap it out with something else. You've got to make sure that the smoke seals are the original smoke seals that the door was tested with. Otherwise, you could inadvertently compromise the effectiveness of the door. Smoke seal, the hot smoke seals, the intermittent smoke seals, you might see a white plastic strip or a brown plastic strip. And again, they're very specific to the door. Some of these generate low pressure but high volume, so they fill a big gap. Others generate high pressure and low volume. Fire door seals generally are the latter, because we want them to actually seal the door into the frame, so the door doesn't warp and become distorted due to the heat. So they develop quite a high pressure, which seals the door in the frame. It means it's a bit more difficult to get through the door, but actually by the time that's gone off, the conditions either side or on the fire side is going to be quite severe anyway. But so this is really just sort of fire doors look the same, but they're not the same. They're a kit of parts, and you have to be very careful about maintaining and changing those parts if that becomes necessary. Okay. So 2 new terms that have come up recently: nominal and notional fire doors. Nominal fire doors, this is sort of quite a new one, I think. A door that provides the performance of a fire door but has not undergone fire resistance testing. Okay, well, if you haven't tested it, it's a bit tricky to say how it's going to perform. Having said that, 44 mil thick door, 3 hinges, steel, good door furniture, some smoke seals. It looks like a fire door, it feels like a fire door, it probably functions as a fire door, but the fire performance is based on the opinion of the inspector. If you're going to base a decision about maintaining or replacing doors on the decision or on the opinion of a fire door inspector, then you need to make sure that fire door inspector knows what he's talking about. Sometimes, if they lack the experience or confidence, they're on the side of safety and say, no, change it. I can't, give you any guarantees on it, and rip them out, which might be a perfectly good fire door. Quite often in listed buildings, historic buildings, you'll come across this where you can't change the door because of conservation requirements, and you'll need to get an assessment done on the fire performance of that door, or maybe have a spare one that's tested. But it doesn't mean you don't need to throw it in, you need to throw it in the skip. There's some steps that can be taken to confirm whether it's going to do its job properly or not. More commonly, we get these what are called notional fire doors. These are generally the older doors that probably met the standards and the requirements in place at the time of construction or the time the door was installed, but they don't meet current requirements, and neither do they need to. The old days, we didn't have smoke seals, we had 1-inch door stops, and when I was an inspecting officer in the brigade, we get all excited we found a 1-inch door stop, we'd measure it, because if it was less than 1 inch, it wasn't a fire door. If it was more than 1 inch, it was a fire door. It's a lot easier now because they have smoke seals. But the fact that a door has a smoke seal doesn't mean it's a fire door, because people put them on a lot of doors, really. So a notional fire door is one that probably doesn't meet current standards. The fire test hasn't really changed in the last 50, 60 years. So certainly the British standard test hasn't changed that much. But again, I come across cases where fire risk assessors said, but there's no labels on the door. I can't find the label saying it's a fire door, so you need to change it. And they get put in the skip. And they're probably quite reasonable fire doors. So again, the person carrying out the assessment, the person carrying out the fire risk assessment for the building just does need to know what they're looking at. Because it doesn't have a label on it, doesn't mean it's not a fire door.
Just on that, Steve, sorry, before you move on, it's interesting when one looks at the guidance documents, because when these regulations were published, there was an immediate question about who was going to be undertaking these inspections and what level of qualification or experience they had to have. And we all know, we're all very familiar with the reality in the market at the moment, where fire engineers and fire risk assessors are very stretched. But the regulations, the guidance of the regulations provide, certainly in my view, I think a sort of an overly simplistic approach to the question of qualification. And they say that a member of staff on, quote, simple instruction, unquote, can carry out a fire risk assessment. I'm going to ask Andrew the same question in due course, but I'd welcome your view on that and whether you think that is an appropriate level of qualification, because it rather does beg the question, what is the instruction and who's going to be giving it?
I think that advice is slightly overly simplistic, probably coming from their regulatory impact analysis, that they don't want to bring requirements in that are going to cost disproportionate amounts of money. I think that there's two levels there. This is almost like a functional check. Does the door open and close? Is it visual inspection? Does it reveal whether it's damaged or not? And if you have any queries, then you need to probably refer out to someone with more experience, whatever. But there is a place for an initial inspection, I think, of a number of doors, and that would be intrusive, or you might take the architraves off, because if you've got a really good fire door, meets all the requirements in all circumstances, but when you take the architrave off, there's an inch gap around the door which hasn't been fire stopped, then that fire door is not going to be doing its job, really, because it is a kit, including the frame, etc. So there is a place for a more intrusive investigation if you believe, if there's a question mark about how good the doors are, and you might pick a small sample through the building, do a more intrusive investigation. Once it's satisfied that those doors are fit for purpose, then these ongoing tests, which I think the government's view is, they are pretty standard tests. And there's two quotes there from various government guidance documents that Lee referred to. And you could just have like a caretaker or concierge who walks through. I'd probably say ideally you'd walk through the building daily to check exit routes and all those sort of things. And as they're doing that, they're passing through all those doors in the common areas, and they'll be opening them and closing them. And it's just a matter of being aware of what to look for. If something is obviously damaged, then report it. If it's not closing, if it's binding on the carpet, report it. If the glass is broken, report it, etc., etc. So, these are visual inspections, or intended to be visual inspections, just to make sure the door sort of closes and is probably going to be okay. But I think there is a need for a more objective, intrusive investigation at some point, just to make sure the doors are the right doors for that situation, in the right locations, and installed correctly. Once you have that assurance, then this is like your MOT kicking the tires.
Yeah. So we think that really, if employees of a responsible person spend maybe half a day or a day learning about fire doors and given appropriate instruction, that should be good enough, shouldn't it?
I think a bit of awareness and a good checklist, which I wouldn't be surprised if we saw in a minute. If a good checklist, and it's do they understand what those items? Do they understand what the door closer is? Do they understand its role, its purpose? Do they understand the purpose of the smoke seals? What constitutes damage? What constitutes, something you can ignore to something that can be reported. But you need someone then to audit those checklists to see if there's additional action necessary. The worst thing, I think, is doing the checklist, finding there are some faults identified, filing that away and doing nothing about it. That way leads to enforcement notices and prosecutions.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Sorry about that.
That's okay. No, it's good. Please then. So again, this is the government's, the minimum requirements. So they're not, it's a very low bar. You know, they should be looking, are there any alterations been made to the door, the glazing or the air grills? Or damage to those, really, I suppose. Are the gaps around the doors acceptable? That's a bit more tricky. You can get little gap seals, which you just put in and it shows it's okay. I think it's something like 2 to 4 mil is the maximum gap, apart from at thresholds. British Standard 8214 contains more information, but you wouldn't expect your normal door inspector to sort of have access to that standard on site necessarily. But if there are excessive gaps, or if it looks excessive, it may just need adjusting, or it may need new smoke seals. Are the smoke seals and hinges okay? Hinges probably okay. They come with generally 4 or 6 screw holes, and you do see a number that have only got 2 screws in. So, you know, it's not just are the hinges there and do they look like steel? They should be CE marked, so you want to check that. But they should have all the screw holes filled. So if they haven't been screwed in properly, then that's going to affect the ability of the door to stay in situ during a fire. Does it close from all angles? I think the government's advice is open it to 90 degrees, let it close fully against the latch, open it to 15 degrees or so, let it close fully against the latch. And that's probably all you need to do for the doors, really. No visible damage to the door set or furniture. If there is damage, is it likely to affect the performance of the door? If so, it needs to be reported. If you have things such as door selectors on some double doors or automatic hold open devices, they need to be released to make sure that they work properly as well. So the more systems you add to the door, then you need to make sure that's all tested. Okay, Ellie. Fire door inspector schemes, there are a few. You can get a diploma in fire doors and you can use a post-nominals FD. As far as I'm aware, there's no control over these schemes and people can run these training courses a half day. If you want to send someone on those or you want to employ someone with a diploma in fire doors, great. The view is you don't need to. It should be something the RP or an employee can do as part of their normal activities. If, however, there are concerns about a door or there's any unknowns, then seek the advice from perhaps someone who's done a fire door course. Or I'd sort of suggest you seek the advice from a fire engineer, preferably a chartered engineer who's registered with the Institution of Fire Engineers, purely because that gives you the ultimate level of sort of third-party approval, if you like. Okay, thank you. So the fire and rescue services will be all over this. This is, you know, they have been stung by criticism, so you can expect them to be stepping up on this. They will audit, inspect and enforce fire risk assessments, inspection and maintenance records, referred to record keeping. I think, you know, you have to. If you can't prove, if you haven't got records that these were tested, these were inspected, the assumption will be you haven't done it. So you do need to keep records, but having made those records, if they highlight issues with the doors, for example, then you need to put steps in place to rectify those defects. They will provide assistance to you in understanding and complying with their duties. They are helpful. They have documents available. Both the National Fire Chiefs Council and individual brigades will have documents that you can use. But they will serve enforcement notices where necessary, probably more so now than ever in the past. Again, because of criticism they've had, where they might have given words of advice previously or an informal letter. They've been criticised for doing that. So they will issue enforcement notices even when it may not be necessary, but it proves that they've taken some necessary steps. Bear in mind those notices will be on a public register somewhere. Flat entrance doors and external walls included in fire risk assessments, they'll be looking to see those. There's some finessing around that as to, you know, do you need a full fire risk appraisal of the external walls, or is it just a statement in the risk assessment? The information you need to provide to residents, Lee's referred to that, I think, or Ellie referred to that. The brigade will audit that information. They'll expect to see what was provided and when. Best endeavours, that's been spoken about, and then record the steps to ensure the check's been carried out. They will audit those records and they will use those as evidence whether or not you've complied with your requirements under the various regulations and orders. So it brings back to, thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Steve. We've had lots of questions, as one would expect, during Steve's presentation. So we'll come on, we'll deal with questions after Andrew has spoken. So I'm delighted to introduce Andrew Mellor. Morning, Andrew. Oh, you're on mute, Andrew. First time I've ever had to say that to you, I have to say. Oh.
Is that better?
Yep.
Good. Sorry, good morning, everyone. Thanks. I'm just going to build on what the other speakers have said, and as an architect, I'm going to show you some images. So first of all, really, what is this process? How do we inspect these doors? So next slide, please, Ellie. So just to set out again, which of the doors we've got to inspect. We've got to inspect the common area doors. So these are the doors between typically the lift and stair court and the common area corridor outside the flat doors, and we've got to look at these quarterly. The riser cupboard doors and the store doors, which are fire doors, and they're also quarterly, and then the flat entrance doors, which are annually. Just a bit of background on our experience on this. So we are typically knocking on people's doors to get, before this legislation came in, to get access to the flat entrance doors, and we can typically get access to 30% of the doors, given there are more people home working today. And we often find that some of them are tenants rather than the flat owner. They still let us in to inspect the doors. So on that basis, that suggests there's probably 4 visits required to get access to the doors. So it would mean sensible to consider that we're going to inspect these flat entrance doors every time we inspect the common area doors, maybe, and to plan that, to do that, schedule that over the year. But we've also found that we have to access some of the doors outside of working hours because people do work, of course, and they don't want to take time off just to let you inspect their flat entrance door. So I think you've got to account for the fact that there will be some out of hours working to inspect some of these doors, and we typically find on some recent projects 10 to 20% of the doors have got to be inspected outside working hours, and by that I mean, you know, before work and after work rather than at weekends. Next slide, please, Ellie. So Steve's covered what we've got to check, but just to build on that. So we're looking at both sides of the door. Importantly, we're looking to damage to the door, damage to the frame, damage to the glazing, or damage to the components. By components, I mean the handles, the hinges, and the closers. We're looking for excessive gaps to the perimeter, and that's to the frame and at the threshold. Missing seals, but also Steve talked about the types of fire seals, but we're looking at whether these have been painted over. And quite often we find on the older doors that they have been painted over. And does the door close properly? And then there's an added requirement here, I think, really, which is not mentioned, but has a resident changed the door to their flat? And we do find on occasion that people have changed the door to their flat, and that's going to cause some problems, obviously, in terms of getting that door replaced if it's not a certified fire door. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at hinges, and Steve took us through some of this, but we've got a number of examples here where in the left and the far right photograph, these hinges have been changed on these doors throughout this building. The hinges are somewhat smaller than the original hinges, and probably were not of the capacity to take the weight of the fire door, and they're starting to come away from the frame and also away from the door, and in 4 locations in this building I found that literally the fire doors were falling off. And it's incredible to think that's the case when the property manager is going in on a weekly basis to review the conditions in the building, that they've not noticed that the fire doors are literally falling off their frames. And that's, as Steve was talking about, those more regular checks with someone who's got a bit more knowledge and knows what they're looking at would have picked these up. But also in these occasions as well, the hinge pins are coming out, and we not often, but we sometimes find this. And of course, if those hinge pins come out all the way, then the hinge is not going to operate. And ultimately, if it comes out of all the hinges, then the door's going to fall off at some point. And we've not just got a fire risk there, we've got a potential injury risk to those who use the building. Next slide, please. And we're looking at perimeter gaps here, and this is one just at the threshold, and you can see that this gap is probably deemed to be excessive at 25 millimeters. Steve talked about the doors closing, and you probably can't tell too well from the photograph, but that photograph on the right, that door is not closing properly. The closer, overhead closer, needs adjusting. There's probably a 10 to 20 mil gap all the way around the frame where the door is not hitting the stops. Next slide, please. And then we talk about seals and closures. So on the left-hand side, we can see that the fire seal, the smoke seal, is missing from the head of the door frame. Sometimes we find these seals in the door itself. Sometimes we find them in the frame. But often there are pieces missing, or they're damaged or have been painted over. With regard to closures, we are looking obviously whether the closer is there. And in this particular situation, the closer wasn't there. It had been completely removed. You can see the remnants of fixings for that. Often we find that the closer, particularly on older doors, may have been changed. It might still be adequate, but we've got to be checking that it's functioning properly. And sometimes in flat entrance doors, we find the old Perco chain closers, and they've either been removed, as I understand happened in Grenfell in some situations, or they've been cut perhaps by residents because they're fed up with the door slamming as they go in and out of the flats. So all things to watch out for. Next slide, please. So damage to doors, the damage on the right hand side is very evident, and that's a riser door that's obviously been damaged in use. And sometimes we're having to attribute these in a legal situation where it's a damage in use or whether it's a defect from an installation phase, such that the claim can be made. On the bottom left, slightly more difficult to see, but that glazing panel has been replaced. It's not got what we call a kite mark on it. And as a result of that, the beading at the bottom of that glazing has not been reinstalled and therefore needs to be replaced at the very least. Presumably it was lost during the reinstallation process. Next slide, please. So we now start to think about the record keeping, and you cannot obviously start to undertake this fire door inspection process until you've got your record keeping process established. Otherwise, how are you going to record what the conditions are? How are you going to record whether there's any urgent defects in the repairing, and how are you going to record what the repair process and if that repair has been undertaken? So this could be some more basic, simple of recording. It could be simply a spreadsheet that's kept for a particular building, but I'd like to see a more intelligent method, and there are software packages out there at the moment that do this, where you can take the floor plan of the building. Of course, under the new regulations, certainly for your taller buildings, you do need to have a floor plan, so that could be used for this very purpose. And you're doing what we call tagging back to the specific door location on that plan. And you're going to be adding photographs of the door, both sides, showing the condition. You're going to be taking photographs, perhaps more detailed, of the hinges and the closer, and specifically where there are defects, you're going to be taking photographs as well and including those. And you're going to be writing some general notes about the condition of the door. Does it close? What condition of the closer? The hinges, the seals, and if there are any perimeter gaps, as we've just gone through, and recording all that in what is essentially a live document. What you also may want to have then is some kind of RAG rating system in your organisation for the observed defects and prioritise for repair. So obviously where the door's falling off and the hinges are giving way, that's a red, and that door needs to be replaced ASAP. And then it needs to be recorded as being replaced and put into this recording solution that you've developed. Next slide, please. So before anyone says, the diagram on the right, the image on the right, is relates to a front door for a flat. It is relates to fire doors. It's the best I could find on the internet. It was a very good example from Enfield Council of how to communicate with residents about the planned works and the benefits of installing the new fire doors. Similarly, all the fire doors were defunct in this particular building or buildings and had to be replaced on the previous programs. But I think there's a number of things to consider here. To communicate with residents, it needs to be simple to understand. To me, that usually suggests graphics or images. Do you need to have this in different languages? Does it need to be in Braille, for example? Is it in a digital format? Is it in hard copy format? And if you've got to provide it on an annual basis and you've got a number of buildings, it suggests to me that you're going to produce the same document for all of your building stock, and maybe it is digital, and maybe on occasion you have to print a few copies out to give to residents, but maybe you're emailing it to everyone. As has been gone through by previous colleagues, this needs to set out the importance of fire doors, that the fire doors need to be kept closed, that you do not tamper with doors or fittings or report damage or faults, and most importantly, you don't replace your fire door with one you think looks nicer. Next slide, please. That's it.
Excellent. Well, look, Andrew, thank you very much indeed. That was excellent. And we've got lots of questions, so I'm going to start from the top, and some of them will involve me, some of them will involve Lee, and others, Steve and Andrew. So the first question, which is a question we get asked a lot, and I know Andrew gets asked a lot, is, do the regs apply to buildings above 11 metres? Well, yes, they do, in respect of the stuff that we've been talking about, which are the annual and quarterly checks of front entrance, flat door, fire doors and communal fire doors. But of course, the obligation to provide residents with information applies to all buildings that have 2 or more residential dwellings within them. But the question is, can you please confirm how height is calculated? And that takes us back to approved document B. So Andrew, do you want to take that one?
I'll try to, yes, we can give you an answer. There is some deliberation in the industry as always about measurements of heights under these various acts that are coming through. But for this intents and purposes, I think we can say that it's measured from the lowest level of the external ground up to the level of the uppermost occupied floor within the building.
Yeah. I mean, my view, for what it's worth, is that the government needs to introduce a completely unambiguous and clear revision of approved document B that sets out precisely how one measures height, because although we have approved document B, it's not entirely clear, and we've had lots of cases where there has been disagreement about the height of a building based on where the measurement has taken place. So I agree with you, Andrew, that, you know, given all of the different regulations that we now have that relate that impose obligations by reference to building height, I think the government need to actually provide us with something that is a bit less ambiguous and is straightforward. So, so that's that one. The next question from Guy Collar is this. He apologises for asking a detailed question. I didn't no need to apologise, Guy, but just trying to understand the requirements regarding replacement and damage. Some of our residents have screwed letter catchers to the inside of their front entrance doors due to disability, etc. Would this be regarded as damage and require removal? And if so, can we just make good the damage? So in other words, can we unscrew the letter catcher or whatever device has been installed on the door? So do you want to take that one, Steve?
Yeah, I can do. It depends, which is not a very good answer, I'm afraid, but it does depend. First of all, that suggests there's a letterbox, which is unusual in a fire door, because if you have a letterbox, you have to have a fire-resisting letterbox, and such things do exist, because you can't take a fire door, which is a solid wooden blank, cut a hole in it, stick a metal flap over it, quite often an aluminium flap. It's going to compromise the ability of the fire door. It ceases to be a fire door by definition, really. So if it has a letterbox, it should be a proper letterbox, and the flap should be probably steel and have some sort of intumescent lining in it. If the catcher is then just screwed to the inside of the door, strictly speaking, it is affecting the ability of the door to do its job, but actually it's one of those things you might take a view on, and you know, it's 2 screw holes or 4 screw holes. Weighing that up, the damage and the impact on the fire door, weighing that to the effect of the resident, if it's taken away, with their inability to bend down and pick the letters up, etc., etc. There has to be some degree of reasonableness attached. And that's where the risk assessment or the review of the door must deal with that and say, look, strictly speaking, you know, it probably wasn't tested with this letterbox, this letter catcher thing. However, it's fixed by 4 small steel screws. These are fully embedded in the door, and we've taken the view that, you know, for the purposes of these tenants, this is beneficial to them, and it doesn't compromise the effectiveness of the door significantly. And I think, you know, that could be supported. But strictly speaking, if you add anything to the door that wasn't tested when that door was certificated, then you can't rely on that fire test certificate. So we're moving from sort of compliance to safety, and I would suggest it's not a big safety compromise, provided the letterbox itself is dealt with and is protected appropriately.
Well, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because this again is a good illustration of the fact that those who are carrying out these risk assessments have to have a degree of knowledge that allows them to make those reasonably subtle risk assessment calls, doesn't it? Right, so a question from David Gould, who's raised the vexed question of residents who change their front entrance fire door to say UPVC front entrance door. And he's asked the question, can responsible persons expect any support from the fire and rescue services in terms of enforcement actions against the leaseholder to comply with cases where they refuse to cooperate? Well, I think I can answer that question. Ultimately, the obligation is not on the leaseholder; it's on the responsible person, and the guidance is pretty clear in that it's the responsible person's obligation to get access and take whatever steps are necessary to carry out the risk assessment. So the fire and rescue services may well support you in terms of writing a letter. They may even knock on the door of this particular leaseholder. But in terms of taking enforcement action, the buck is going to stop with the responsible person. And I completely agree with what Steve has said. The fire and rescue services are likely to be reasonably proactive in terms of enforcement under these new regulations. So really the question is going to come down to, have you used best endeavours to try and deal with it? And if the answer to that question is yes, you have, then the fire and rescue service can't really criticise you. But if you've not taken best endeavours, then there could well be room for criticism. With a UPVC front entrance door, your risk assessment is going to start and finish, I think, simply by touching the door and observing it. It's clearly not a fire door, and therefore you will need to take steps, as Lee has said, under the lease or whatever arrangements you have to try and have that fire door replaced. But ultimately, if it's not your fire door, and it's the leaseholder's fire door, and they are point blank refusing to change it, then Lee, I mean, I'm not sure that there's much a responsible person can do in those circumstances.
Well, in those circumstances, the likelihood is that they've altered or they've replaced that door probably unlawfully, because what would have been there would have been a fire door. So if they've replaced it with something that's fallen below that as-built standard, which then almost certainly they will have if it's a UPVC door, then the hope and expectation is that there will be some lease terms in there that you'll be able to use to enforce, or in the very worst case scenario, you'll be able to use some implied terms that will require them to replace it. And that may well require legal action by way of an injunction or otherwise. But in 9 out of 10 cases, my experience is about working with the resident, trying to do as much as you can, getting that communication. Certainly, I've had occasions where clients have worked very closely with the relevant fire and rescue authority, and they've really helped trying to sort of educate and communicate why those actions need to be taken. Occasions where you might also want to ensure that leaseholder uses approved contractors, fire doors that you know and you trust, having that sort of in place, doing all of those steps before you start going down the legal road, which generally speaking, takes a lot longer, is very expensive, and damages longer term relations. But the hope is that there will certainly be something you can do. It's just a case of having that lease reviewed, making sure you've got that evidence, either from a fire engineer or otherwise, explaining why that door is not a fire door and would have fallen below that as-built standard.
Okay, thank you. A question from Mudita. How can we check the replacement smoke seal or intumescent strip to see if it complied with the original type of seal with which the door was tested with? So this is the point that you touched on, Steve.
It's very difficult, if not impossible. You have to, the steps are, you would get the original fire test report when the door was provided and installed. If you happen to get that, and very rarely can you get it, if you happen to get that, it will list out all of the components that were on the door and the door frame when it was tested. And it will also have an extended field of application that might say you can also use these other components with this door and it won't affect the fire performance. But getting those test reports, not a test certificate, the full test report is very tricky, certainly when the building's a number of years old. If you know who the door manufacturer was or is, you can go back to the manufacturer and they might be able to give advice, but it's really tricky. And some door sets are tested with, as Mark, I think Andrew referred to, the seals in the door frame, some are on the leaf, some might be hidden behind a thin veneer of lipping in the frame. And and they've all been tested differently, and it will all be in the test report. So it's really difficult, and sometimes it gets to the point, if you can't identify the door manufacturer and you can't find the original fire test report, you look at BS 8214, which gives you general guidance when that information is not available, and you have to try to come up with a solution based on that. What is the best we can do with those unknowns? But it doesn't mean you have to scrap the door and the door frame and replace it with a brand new one. Just means you do have to take care specifying door seals, smoke seals, etc., that are going to do the job and are not going to compromise. If you have the wrong intumescent, for example, it might force the door open, or it might not hold the door closed against the frame. So, it is a very tricky issue, and there are no simple answers, unfortunately. There's some detective work to be done, and then there's a sort of an application of common sense and a bit of engineering and experience to come up with what we think is the best solution, recording that. So if anyone comes along at some point and says, why is this one on here? There's an audit trail, if you like, of the steps that have gone through, the rationale and the result. And that's probably the best you can do. And I would say, using this best endeavours term, that should demonstrate, use your best endeavours to sort that out.
Right. It wouldn't be a legal seminar without the sentence or the phrase, no simple answers, would it? Thank you very much, Steve. Another question, I think, for you before we come on to Neil's question, which is, this is from Peter Rutherford. What is the guidance for notional fire doors? Will a burn test be required for front entrance doors to determine if they need to be replaced?
No, if it looks like a duck and sounds like a duck, it's probably a duck, and I apply that to fire doors, and it works 9 times out of 10. If it's that old, it has a 1-inch door stop. If it's otherwise in good condition, the gaps aren't excessive, and it closes, then it's going to function as a fire door. If it's slightly newer than that, but it still doesn't meet current requirements, unless you have good reason to believe it won't perform its function, then there should be no reason for it to change it. And the government has said, just because you can't identify it as a fire door doesn't mean it's not acceptable as a fire door if it meets the requirements and the performance requirements of a fire door. So solid core, if it's a hollow core door, it's probably not going to be okay. Solid core door, timber or steel or glass or whatever, with all the furniture that goes with it, CE marked, steel. There are some fire doors that do have aluminium door furniture, pass the test apparently. I'm not sure how they do that. But generally it's steel or gunmetal or brass in the old days, but generally steel door furniture, a solid core door, self-closing, not warped, looks like it will do the job. It will probably do the job. It might not be a standard FD30S fire door, but it will perform the function of a fire door.
Thank you, Steve. Neil Clutterbuck asked an interesting question, which I have to say I don't know the answer to. I think I know the answer, but which is, do conservation orders override fire regulations? I don't think they do, Neil, but I may be wrong about that. So I'm going to have a look at that question, and I will provide a written answer to you once I've looked that up. But it's a very interesting question because, of course, lots of the buildings that we're dealing with are going to be listed, and we still have to risk assess the fire doors. Right, we've had a question from Neil Griffiths. Are you suggesting that fire door records should only be made on exceptions or defects rather than all good records? Well, I think the question Neil's asking there is, do you have to keep a written record of an inspection for every fire door, irrespective of whether or not it requires remediation or not? And the answer to that question is emphatically yes, you do. Obviously, there is going to be more to say about doors that are defective or require maintenance or remediation than doors that have passed the test, but you have to have a written record of every fire door. We have another question. What do you think is the risk of challenge on reasonableness if service charge costs were incurred because a landlord chose to employ someone to inspect the doors for the purposes of these regulations? Or would that approach be considered reasonable? Lee, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, as ever with lease interpretation, it's going to come down to the wording of the lease, but most modern leases will, generally speaking, be wide enough to capture all costs of complying with your obligations. And whether that's outsourcing those to a third party because you don't have anyone internally to do it, even if you did have somebody internally to do it, the likelihood is that those costs would form part of the service charge calculation anyway. But generally speaking, whatever the costs are of carrying out these checks are likely to be passed down under the service charge provision. The reasonableness of those are going to be that sort of market rate element. So, spending very significant sums of money on very simple checks may well be, under scrutiny by the FTT. If, for example, you employed a very expensive fire engineer to check every single door, that's clearly not what the guidance and regulations expect. But generally speaking, reasonable costs of ensuring that the checks are carried out at the level that we've gone through today. Certainly the expectation is that those would be easily passed down to the service charge, and there will be sufficient service charge machinery already to allow you to do that. And of course, the first tier tribunal is going to be sympathetic to landlords to ensure that they can comply with these. So I think, a sensible, common sense approach is probably the easiest, steadfast way to look at that.
Great, thank you. One for you, I think, Andrew, from David Summers, a very interesting question. In respect to simple door repairs, i.e. closers that need to be adjusted, doors that are binding on carpets or ironmongery that needs to be changed, do we need to employ specialist contractors to undertake those repairs, or can we employ a general repair contractor to undertake these works? And David points to an interesting phenomena, which is that there appears to be a general reluctance in the market currently, where repair contractors are refusing works as they advise that they're not competent. So what do you think about that, Andrew?
Some of those defects where, for example, they're missing screws or the doors dropped slightly, I think they're general repairs that can be undertaken by relatively competent maintenance person. Some of the defects I've seen, but when we've got doors that are, hinges are dropping off completely, I think those doors need to be fully replaced, I have to say, and then you would need a competent installer. But as Steve said, you can't just replace ironmongery with another set of ironmongery. You need to go back to the door test certificate, make sure that ironmongery matches. So you're going to need someone competent to be able to do that process in the first place.
Yeah, I think there's also the PI insurance angle as well. I've no doubt that a lot of small maintenance contractors are being told by their PI insurers not to touch fire doors. So there's going to be that element as well. But thank you very much, Andrew. Another question, I think, this is from an anonymous attendee. Hi, if a door is a good fire door standard, is it acceptable to add smoke seals, door closers if it does not have any? So we're talking here about your duck, to put it in the colloquial term. But there aren't any smoke seals, and there isn't a door closer, because of course you can have an effective fire door without a door closer. But if you were to put a door closer on and add smoke seals, are you going to be compromising the performance of that fire door?
Again, it depends. This is where you have to either go back to the manufacturer or look at the fire test report. Most fire doors will have been tested with the self-closer, and you might not put the self-closer on if you install it on a riser or a cupboard, but you should be able then to fit a self-closer retrospectively. Smoke seals, again, most of them will have been tested as FD30S doors rather than just FD30 doors, so they will accept smoke seals, but the right type, the type they were tested with. So you do have to go back to the original manufacturer to get them to tell you and confirm what is the self-closer that you used on the test and what are the smoke seals, hot and cold smoke seals they used on the test. And if you install those, or if those are installed by a competent contractor, then you're not going to affect the performance of the fire door. If you just stick on any self-closer and any type of smoke seals, then you're not going to improve the fire door and turn it to an FD30S door, and you may actually compromise its effectiveness marginally.
Yeah. Okay. A very good question from Jeanette Spence here. Could you please clarify if a communal area, if a communal area is not above 11 metres but does have 2 or more dwellings, then the checks still apply to these flat entrance doors? Well, the regime set out in the Fire Safety Act, which of course requires us to carry out fire risk assessments of external wall systems, also includes within it an obligation to carry out a risk assessment of fire doors. Now, the Fire Safety Act doesn't really deal with it beyond that very simple point. But I was talking at a seminar last week with members of the NFCC who take the view, unless I misunderstood them, that obligation in the Fire Safety Act, which of course complies to any building with 2 or more residential dwellings in it, is the principal risk assessment obligation, and the obligation under these new regulations are in effect the secondary one. So in other words, the fire risk assessor goes in and has a look at the fire doors and makes a general risk assessment of them. And if the building's above 11 metres in height, then they need to carry out the more detailed inspections. The reality is that we have to take fire doors into account for buildings of all height when we carry out a risk assessment. So, for example, but it doesn't extend in buildings below 11 metres to the regime that we have in the fire safety regulations, and that's the important point. But it doesn't mean that if we identify in a building that's 3 stories high, 8 or 9 metres in height, that we have a bunch of UPVC doors that have been changed out by residents. That is going to be something the risk assessor would have to deal with in their risk assessment, and steps will have to be taken to remedy that. But for buildings below 11 metres, the obligation to inspect doesn't extend to the more forensic requirements of the fire safety regulations, but they still have to be assessed in general terms. And I know that's a slightly unsatisfactory response, but that's down to the fact that I suspect what happened is that when the Fire Safety Act was published, the draftsman of that particular section of the Act thought that it was going to give rise to a more forensic approach to inspecting fire doors, and that's not transpired. And so we now have the regime of the fire safety regulations. But you cannot ignore fire doors in buildings below 11 metres. That's the key. So another question from another anonymous attendee: if a resident front entrance door has a letterbox, is this fire safe? Well, I think you've kind of addressed that, Steve. Our housing association has many older blocks with old doors that have these built in. Well, I think we ultimately come back to your assessment of you can still have an effective fire door with these letterboxes in them. It's a question of how they're being manufactured and installed, one assumes.
Yeah, there should be. It's either going to be a steel plate either side, which maintains the integrity of the fire door. There's no insulation requirements for fire doors generally, or it's going to have an intumescent element to it, which will seal up the gap in the event of a fire in the flat. So it's going to have something, but just having a typical aluminium or brass flap on your door isn't going to be sufficient.
Yeah. An interesting question from Neil Griffith: would a leaseholder not be a Section 5.3 person under the fire safety order and so potentially liable for action from the enforcing authority? Well, the answer to that is technically yes, but certainly in our experience, the fire authorities will generally look to enforce against a responsible person. It's much easier to do that, but there is, of course, it is possible. It is theoretically possible they could do it against individual leaseholders. Next question: if a new building, if in new build, if a fire door has its fire label removed or painted over, would this door be refused and replaced for legal completion to take place? Well, I think that there are a number of sort of separate questions there. In terms of legal completion, if you're talking about practical completion of the works for the purposes of a construction contract, if your EA is unable to determine whether the door that's been installed is in fact a fire door that complies with current regulations, then that would be, in my view, a very good basis for refusing practical completion until such time as the contractor is able to demonstrate that it is in fact a fire door. And where the sticker or the kite mark identifying it as a fire door has been painted over or lost, then it should be replaced, it seems to me. Because it would have been lost or painted over by that contractor in carrying out the works. Hopefully that's answered that question. Another one Are there any composite fire door sets now approved that meet current fire door recommendations? As I understand, with the recent changes, there are not many on the market. Looking at composite from a maintenance point of view to prevent going back to paint, etc. So if it's not wood, are there composite fire doors on the market? Well, Andrew, you may know the answer to that question.
I don't, Mark, I'm afraid. I would need to go away and research that. Be confident about the answer.
Yeah. Do you know of any composite fire doors on the market, Steve?
I don't, but I haven't looked. So
Yeah.
there will be manufacturers trying to get an edge, but
Yeah.
I don't know, engineered.
Well, if I had a spare few £1 million floating around, I might too invest in a fire door factory. But there we are. So we don't know the answer to that question, but we will come back to you with an answer. I've had a question from Thomas Kearney. Do you need to do a burn test to a domestic certified fire door if the customer has installed an automatic door closer to comply with the new regulation? I think the answer to that question is no, you don't, for the reasons that Steve has given. One in relation to your slides from Darren Vickers, Andrew. In one of Andrew's slides, it showed the screw holes left from a missing closer that was fixed to the architrave. Is it acceptable to secure a closer to the second fixed joinery?
Do you mean I guess the question is about retaining the holes or using those same holes for reinstalling? I mean, I don't think you'd ever want to reuse the same holes because I don't think you'd get the same purchase for the screw, but that would be for the installer to check. I mean, in that condition, we would be specifying for those holes to be filled and decorated and the closer to be reinstalled in a slightly different location. But sometimes with the closers, of course, the arm is going to reach the same location. So it's a difficult one to review without seeing the actual condition.
Yeah, no, indeed. I think the answer quite clearly comes down to the actual physical condition of that part of the architrave. Another question from John Griffiths. Could you provide some examples of amber conditions that do not require immediate action and therefore some guidance on the timescale for remedial action? So this is where we identify something perhaps with the fire door that's not fatal to its performance as a fire door, but needs to be eased or adjusted in due course. And what sort of timescales are we looking at? So I suppose this is a question really for Andrew, you and Steve.
After you, Andrew.
I could give a very legal response and say, well, it will come down to a matter of the risk assessor's opinion, subjective opinion, because that's ultimately what it is. There has to be an analysis not only of the defect or the issue with the fire door, but there also needs to be an assessment of whether that is an urgent matter or one that can be done in a sort of a normal maintenance program or planned works program or whatever. And I think without wishing to step on toes, I think that the answer to that, unfortunately, is it's going to come down to the risk assessor's view, and you will be guided by the view of that risk assessor.
I think if it's amber, clearly it's not a significant issue. So maybe something like the door closes against the frame but doesn't overcome the resistance of the latch. And okay, well, we need to get someone in to adjust the self closer. I don't know, 7 to 10 days, because actually anything you're going to do to an amber is going to be reasonably minor. As an adjustment, taking someone with a screwdriver 10 minutes just to adjust the tension to overcome the resistance of the latch without making the door so stiff that you can't open it. So, you know, by definition, it will be a reasonably minor issue that should be remediated with very little effort. If it was anything more than that, it would be a red issue, in which case, you know, you're going to have to look at significant works to the door, replacing the door, whatever, or all new furniture on it. But if it's an amber, it's going to be something, maybe it's a part of the smoke seal that's been broken off. Those reflex seals, the rubber reflex seals, they break, you replace them every couple of months. Maybe you've got a section that's been broken off. And yeah, you need to, I don't know, 7 to 10 days, a month or whatever, but it does come down to the risk assessment. If every door in the building has that defect, then it will take on a more urgent nature than if it was just one door. If it's a door to the stairs, it might take on a more urgent look than if it's a door across a corridor or to a riser possibly. So yes, you've got to look in the circumstances, and like I said, coming back to the assessment of risk. throughout the whole building, not just that one door in its entirety, in isolation.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, Andrew?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Indeed. A very interesting question from Victoria Lloyd. Can you add an Envirograph fireproof litter bag installation to a fire door? That's presumably a proprietary product. Andrew, do you want to take that one?
I don't necessarily understand the question, I'm afraid.
Well, I think
understand?
Victoria's asking whether you can use an Envirograph fireproof litter bag installation. I imagine that's a proprietary product, and if it seems to me that if it is designed to be installed on fire doors and doesn't in any way compromise the fire door, then it would be acceptable. But it would be a case of ensuring that it doesn't compromise the performance of the fire door before being installed. And I think that brings us to the end of the open questions. Here we go. There's one from Patrick Flatty that's just come through. Oh, sorry, Victoria, this wasn't a question; it was advice. Absolutely. On the assumption you're not receiving a commission from Envirograph, that may well be the answer to the question that was posed earlier to Steve about the letter catcher, that there is actually a proprietary product on the market that doesn't compromise the safety of fire doors, or the performance rather of fire doors. So Patrick asks this question: will there be a requirement to inspect flat entrance doors and purpose-built blocks over 11 metres with an open deck balcony approach with more than a single stairwell? According to the current purpose-built guide, these aren't specifically required to be FD 30 doors. So, Steve.
According to what current guidance? I guess that's the LGA guidance, which was buildings in use. I mean, typically the front door of a flat is a 30-minute fire door. You would look at it, and if it wasn't a perfect 30-minute fire door in that situation, then it's the balcony access is vented, and people then, because you've got more than one exit route, you're suggesting people don't have to pass by the front of that entrance door. They can turn either way to the stair. Then, if there was a letterbox in it, or if it didn't have smoke seals, then you'll take a different view, because this whole issue is about a fire in an apartment breaking through the flat entrance door, affecting other people in the building. So in that situation where you've got balcony access, fresh air, open to atmosphere, means of escape in alternative directions, then the importance of the fire door diminishes slightly. But I wouldn't say it doesn't necessarily need to be a fire door, but there is an argument for it being a standard security door or standard front door.
Yes. I'm not sure whether we're still on camera. This has been a slight malfunction, but on the assumption that we are, I think we've come to an end of the questions, and therefore the end of this. Yes, no sales push from Victoria. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us for the seminar. This is going to be something of a journey, and so I hope today we've given you some sort of seeds of thought in terms of how you're going to approach this issue, how you're going to start looking at these fire doors, and crucially how you're going to gather together not only the people who are going to carry out these inspections for you, but also the suggestions from Andrew in terms of how you record the result of your inspections. My view, for what it's worth, is I far prefer the more visual and more sort of practical recording techniques that Andrew advocates, as opposed to the somewhat archaic tick box document that has been produced by the government. But of course, the two of them can be used in tandem, and you can devise your own methodology for doing this, provided, of course, you keep all the information you need to. And I think we've addressed the question of who needs to carry this out. We all agree that it doesn't have to be a fire engineer or a fire risk assessor. As Steve has pointed out, there are courses that people can go on, and there are people such as Steve and Andrew who will have the ability, if required, to recommend people who will be able to give you that training. So we wish you all the very best of luck on your journey, and if you need any legal advice, of course, we're here to help you. It falls for me now to say thank you very much to our guests, Steve Cooper and Andrew Mellor. fantastic as always. And we wish you all a very lovely day, the rest of your Tuesday, and we'll hopefully speak to you shortly. So thank you all very much indeed.